I think museums in general are institutions that have an awful lot of work to do in terms of trust building and relationship building.
The spin was, this is fish bones and some broken pots. It's not that important.
When I took the shoe from the box and I kind of held it in my hands, I spoke. I sort of spoke out loud, and I talked to the shoe about the things that we were doing and what we were hoping that the witness blanket would become.
So some of the things that we have on the wall, for example, are photos
amazing stuff that my mom was doing.
students, and we've actually had
Historically, museums have tended to be a sort of trophy case for colonialism. Looting art and other cultural treasures from invaded countries was part of the colonial way, and Napoleonic France was especially into this. Here's a print from the National Gallery of France depicting a military convoy carrying stolen art arriving in Paris. But times change, and nowadays there's a push happening in museums all over the world to decolonize, a cause that's been addressed in a number of academic publications. You may have heard about the genocide controversy at Winnipeg's Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Famously, the museum initially balked at labeling residential schools as genocidal, but changed its tune after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that the residential school system amounted to cultural genocide.
My name is Karine Duhamel, and I'm the curator for Indigenous content at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I'm Anishinaabe and Métis.
Duhamel knew what she was getting into when she signed up to work at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights.
I was sort of aware as an outsider about some of the controversies at the museum, but it was something that I was really interested in because I think that there is room in institutions for change. I've always found it really interesting to really get in there and to do the work from the inside.
And the work that she wants to do from the inside is decolonization.
Decolonization, and decolonizing museums in particular, has to do with combating the erasure of colonization and of bringing forth Indigenous worldviews and perspectives because they have been under attack for so very long, for centuries. So decolonization for me is a process, it's not a result.
Decolonization in a museum is also about eliminating the colonial lens through which we often are shown the Indigenous experience. A lens which has tended to see Indigenous people as a subject being interpreted by the dominant colonial culture. A lens which sometimes has hidden or dismissed aspects of our history, such as residential schools. Duhamel takes her voice out of the equation.
I really see myself as a facilitator for the telling of stories, not as the storyteller myself. It's not my role and it's not my right to tell stories about communities from which I don't come or that I don't have a connection to. And so for me, it's always been really important first to identify people who want to share their stories, who have a really interesting story to tell, and then to work with those folks to make sure that we're telling it in a way that represents their perspectives.
She used that approach when preparing an exhibit about the forced relocation of the Ahiromute people. The Ahiromute had lived in present-day Nunavut, near Enadai Lake. But in the 1950s and 60s, they were relocated multiple times. And in 2019, the federal government apologized.
And I worked with a community leader, David Surquak, to try to share that story on his behalf. David provided his own artifacts, so we weren't, in a position to have to borrow from another institution. And ultimately, David came for the opening and he did a drum dance with his granddaughter.
But in the past, at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, a former employee says some resistance to decolonized storytelling came from management. That's according to former Indigenous content curator Tricia Logan. Logan says she was asked by management to remove the word genocide in relation to a planned exhibit focused on settler colonial genocide. But museum management disputes her version of events. A communications manager says there was a discussion about wall projections for a gallery in the planning stages, and that Logan had proposed settler colonial genocide as one of the projections. But a committee of managers chose residential schools instead, and these wall projections were ultimately never implemented. Not far from the entrance to the Human Rights Museum, visitors encounter a cast of a human footprint found at the site. Before the museum was built, management decided to put limits on an archaeological dig at the site. It was a dig that some archaeologists say could have revealed more about the indigenous history of land near where the Assiniboine and Red Rivers meet, known to be an ancient meeting place. I asked Aisha Khan, the CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, about the decision to limit excavation, a decision which was made before she began working there.
Do you think enough respect was shown to our past when what's been characterized as just an abbreviated archaeological excavation was allowed to proceed on the site of the museum?
So the dig started in 2008, and I know that there was care taken at the time, and there were elders involved in ensuring that there was care taken. But I think there's a lot more that we have to do, and much of that work, that healing, is what we've started to do through ceremony here in the museum.
So how does museum management anticipate avoiding future interference?
I think that our staff need to have be supported to bring diverse perspectives, to critically analyze issues, to bring informed opinions and their own lived experiences. I haven't heard that safety or security is impeded in any way in the time that I've been here, which gives me comfort.
Another issue with decolonizing a museum like the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is that it's a Crown corporation. It's not hard to imagine conflicts of interest arising when a branch of the Crown is trying to decolonize itself. But Khan emphasizes her commitment to decolonization.
Decolonization is absolutely a focus. I think, how can it not be when we are the Canadian Museum for Human Rights? That's the work that we're doing with elders alongside communities to speak our truth and to speak the truth and inspire others and educate others about the story of our country.
And she says there is a mechanism to counter any colonial tendencies that might come with being in service to the Queen.
So we're created by the Museums Act, and that law gives us that independence from government and that ability to tell stories about the collective history of Canada. We also do that by telling the stories of others with them and moving along together in terms of where we want to go.
One of the best indications of where they want to go is maybe found in a piece of art which the museum shares responsibility for.
The witness blanket is this beautiful piece of truth. We are the stewards of the blanket. The blanket is a collection of stories, and those stories were gathered by artist Carrie Newman. And great care is taken in respecting those stories, and it's the model as to how we were supposed to work, and that's how we're going to work.
After the break, we'll hear from an archaeologist who was less than happy with the thoroughness of the dig done ahead of the building of the museum. The decision to do a limited archaeological dig in 2008 at the site of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights was one that raised some eyebrows, especially among archaeologists already familiar with the importance of the area around where the Assiniboine and Red Rivers meet. Since time immemorial, long before Winnipeg and the Red River settlement, the spot where the museum is located has been a meeting place.
My name is Kevin Brownlee. I'm the Curator of Archaeology at the Manitoba Museum. And background on myself, my father's from Norway House, and so I'm Cree, practicing archaeologist here as curator for nearly 18 years.
And as an archaeologist, Brownlee felt the dig done ahead of building the Human Rights Museum was less than satisfactory.
They followed provincial guidelines when it comes to how much to excavate and that. But you know, provincial, what's minimally required isn't necessarily sort of provide a really adequate picture, I would sort of say. So, I mean, my feeling is more archaeology is always better.
And because of the limited excavation at the site, Brownlee has made a personal choice to not visit the Human Rights Museum. But what did the excavation find?
The number of hearths or cooking areas was huge. And, you know, anything that happens at the Forks, I mean, you know, you certainly want to see more work done in excavations because, yeah, like this tells a really important history.
Not to mention the fact that the same general area is known to have hosted a large pre-contact peace treaty gathering around 700 years ago. And by large, Brownlee means possibly 10,000 people. Brownlee showed us an exhibit in the Manitoba Museum about the variety of sherds, or broken pieces of pottery, found in an area near the Human Rights Museum site.
We know that these groups congregated here but came from an area as far as southern Minnesota, into northwestern Ontario, into the Dakotas, into sort of central and northern Manitoba.
And climate data gives an indication of why there may have been tensions that resulted in the need to meet.
And we know that in advance of that there was climatic instability, and so you would see floods or droughts, and so there was certainly going to be impacts on bison herd populations or even fish spawning. And so, you know, with less, and you know, some of the people that were at that were agricultural villagers coming up from the Minnesota, and so, you know, they were probably having, you know, less successful harvests, and so again you're seeing less resources going around.
A gathering of nations 700 years ago seems like an historically important event, the kind that we might want to investigate fully, given the opportunity. But as Brownlee points out, sometimes colonial history is valued more. Around the same time that the abbreviated dig on the site of the museum was being critiqued, another heritage site nearby, Upper Fort Garry, was threatened as well by a proposed high-rise. The public rallied around the cause to stop the development.
I think I even donated, you know, like, because they were raising money to preserve, to counter this sort of development that was going to destroy Upper Fort Garry. I mean, this is an important part of colonial, and also, I mean, it's got a very Métis story. I mean, that's where Louis Riel was. I mean, so there's a really, it is just as much an Indigenous story. But, you know, here's this sort of built colonial after Europeans arrived, and it mobilized this group of influential people to quickly gather money together and preserve this and build the park that we see there today, which is amazing. And it's great to see when sort of grassroots or the public sort of take on that responsibility.
But there wasn't the same level of support for protecting the site where the Human Rights Museum was going.
The spin was, this is, you know, fish bones and some broken pots. It's not that important. They didn't live here permanently, and somehow that is to make it like less significant or less relevant. And it was hurtful to see that sort of situation sort of unravel and how the discrepancies between those two.
The area around the Human Rights Museum may or may not have revealed more about the peace treaty meeting, but a longer investigation of the site could have told us more about the ancient history of the area as a meeting place. It's called the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Was this abbreviated dig a violation of human rights on some level?
I think a little bit. I mean, I think, one of the pieces with archaeology, I mean, and particularly from indigenous peoples, I mean, we've seen archaeology do horrible things to our heritage. And not only horrible things to our heritage, but also horrible things in disenfranchising us from that heritage. Like the people that were here were more sophisticated than the Indians that were met, and therefore they all of a sudden rip our history from the people that live in this area. And we look globally, and indigenous people are often separated from that history. And and I think that is a huge infringement on indigenous rights, and their human rights. That we are who we are because of the past. That we're only here today because of the events that have happened and shaped our ancestors and why we're here. And if indigenous people are saying something is important, it's because it's important.
Coexist. Diversity is strength, and each contributes to the well-being of one another.
Of course, what is considered important indigenous history by the colonial system has changed considerably in the last few years. When I went to Canadian public school, the residential school story was considered such an inconsequential part of Canadian history that it wasn't mentioned at all. Which is maybe part of the reason why encountering the witness blanket is so deeply moving. The witness blanket is, as museum CEO Aisha Khan suggested, a beautiful piece of truth. But what is it exactly? I spoke with its creator to get a better understanding of how the witness blanket fits in with decolonization efforts at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights.
My name is Kerry Newman. My traditional name is Hayalth Kingame. I come from the Kwakwaka'wakw and the Stalo nations here in British Columbia. That's on my father's side. And on my mother's side, I'm English, Irish, Scottish settler stock from Saskatchewan.
Newman was selected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to make the witness blanket as a commemorative piece.
I guess my work with the witness blanket began with my father being a residential school survivor. When the TRC put out their call for commemoration initiatives, as an artist, I started to think about what I could do. And after rejecting all of the other things that I'd done in the past, like totems, mostly because I didn't think that they could tell the whole story the way I envisioned it for the whole country, I landed on this idea of gathering objects from all the different residential school sites from across the country and creating a blanket that's made of solid objects from those objects, from the pieces that we gather.
And each object carries with it its own memory of what it witnessed, because as Newman sees it, each object is a living being.
I think of it much the way that we think about our cultural objects in our Kwakwaka'wakw ways, much the way we think of our big houses as our ancestors, that each of those pieces has a right to exist in the way it was meant to be, and then collectively as a blanket, it has many stories to tell.
One of the objects that is part of the blanket is a shoe that Carrie's friend Rosie Hartman found when collecting objects from residential schools for Newman's project.
And when she gathered the piece, and you can see in the film where she actually reaches down into the sort of the mossy forest and lifts this shoe from the site of a burned down residential school. It's a stunning looking piece of history. She gathered it, she wrapped it in paper and put it in a box and took it back to her bed and breakfast.
As it turned out, the shoe had an effect on her sleep that night, which she told Newman about shortly thereafter.
It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and she she said, I have to give you this shoe, but before I do, I have to tell you why I'm here so early on a Friday. And then she recounted, she went back to that night, and she said that night in her bed and breakfast in Carcross, she woke up having a nightmare. And she didn't think much of it at the time, and she packed her stuff, and the next day she came home. And that night, her husband, Shane, woke up, and he was having a nightmare. And so when she asked him about it, he described that he was running in his sleep and he was afraid. And it was the exact same dream that she had had the night before in her bed and breakfast.
And so Newman took very special care of that shoe.
Or in the evening before I went to bed, I went down to my studio and I took the shoe from the box and I kind of held it in my hands. And I could really feel, I was feeling pretty emotional, I think partly by the look of the object of the shoe and thinking about how small it was and who might have worn it, but also by the energy that was with it. And so I sort of spoke out loud, and I talked to the shoe about the things that we were doing and what we were hoping that the witness blanket would become. And I did that each night for the next 4 nights, and each time the emotion that was coming from it shifted. So it went from anger to fear to kind of a deep sadness.
All of which brings us to the unique stewardship agreement which Newman wanted for the witness blanket.
And what we ended up determining was that we would make this agreement for stewardship, where it wasn't sold like a piece of property, and that rather than there being ownership, because I never really felt ownership of it like a thing I could own, or like a piece of property. Rather than doing that, we placed all of the rights around the agreement with the blanket itself. I guess I drew some of my inspiration from treaty, in that the contract is based in relationship, but rather than pitting one party against another in the way that Western contracts often do, where it's about limitation of liability, by aligning ourselves together as sharing responsibility, and placing all rights with the work itself, then we become the accountability for each other, all of that. And there are mechanisms in place to maintain that relationship over time through sharing food together, through regular conversation.
And so the witness blanket is meant to bring its stewards closer together, while acknowledging and remembering the truth of what colonization has done to the people of this land.